Hey everyone, thanks for joining. We're just going to take maybe a minute or two more to let the last few people in, but we're ready to go and glad you joined us for this topic. Got a growing group. I think I'll just sort of jump right into it since there are a couple introductory slides here, and by the time anyone else joins, they'll still be looking at the agenda. This is an interesting topic. We're going through what's essentially a working session here because it's a non-final document. We're looking at the draft guidelines that tell us how the high-risk AI systems will be classified, and you can read them now. We're going to give you a lot of context, both on the legal side and the operations side, about how to think about these. But just be aware that, yes, they could change, and you could be part of why they change by providing your insights as part of the feedback that they're requesting. So, what are we looking at? It's these draft guidelines here. They're broken into three different documents. Essentially, they're general principles. They have the Article 6.1 carve out. That's the Annex 1 route, where we look at product safety, essentially. And then there's the Article 6.2 Annex 3 route, and that's where they look at the 8 designated high-risk use case categories. So you can go in, you can look at employment, education, law enforcement, etc. So we're going to cover all of that, but just know it's three documents, not one. Easy to find. This, of course, does not change the four-tier risk model that's part of the Act. This is just further explanation for how to think about this. And it's supporting both providers and deployers of these systems and the thinking around high risk. And the mandated time frame that this was supposed to come out was February. So we've been waiting, a while for these to come out, and that is part of why you're seeing other delays around the implementation of this. But we have them now, so we should, sort of dig in and learn from them. So what can you expect to learn from us today? What's useful other than just sort of skimming these yourself? We are going to take a look at why your documentation is determining your classification. There's a change in scope here that we're going to dig into in terms of what you should be thinking about. And it's a starting point. It's not an end when you do this work. So it's important to really understand the parameters here on scoping. Which escape valves actually work. We're going to look at the exemptions, especially, 6.3, and why it's narrower than most people might have been hoping. We're going to look at anti-fragmentation, and take a look at, running multi-agent systems and complex pipelines and how that's treated, essentially. When organizations become a provider without knowing it, this is obviously important. You're taking on new obligations you might not have known you had. And then just, keep some key deadlines front and center. For example, the window for the feedback closes June 23rd, which will come quickly. So that's the key background in terms of what we're doing here and why. I will start with introducing myself then. I'm Andrew Clearwater, Chief Trust Officer here at AREA. I have a background in both legal and technology. I run our governance system here, and I also work on the strategy around our governance product. Richard?
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, Richard Purdy here, General Counsel at Area. My background is, I suppose, predominantly corporate commercial transactional lawyer, although I've been working in privacy now for probably about 15, somewhere between 15 and 20 years in a variety of private practice and in-house roles. And then naturally, most recently, my focus has turned to AI governance as well, particularly in the role that I have at Area. Thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, great. So you get two lenses from legal, from operations. Here's the breakdown of how we're going to go through this so that you can be aware of the agenda. We're going to look at, what these are, why now, why are they, coming at us at this time, and what do we need to do with them. We're going to have a couple areas that we dig in on: the intended purpose doctrine, safety component tests. All of these are important to understand in detail. I already flagged earlier this idea of the filter and how ultimately narrow it is, the deployer trap that speaks to the provider implications, and then we'll get right into those timelines. So no mystery about how we're approaching this. Hopefully, this is useful to help you get up to speed on this. And we'll start with you, Richard.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so jumping into the first segment, so why these guidelines and why now? So taking a step back, the Commission has been legally obligated to issue these guidelines since the Act entered into force way back in August 2024. And Article 6.5 is the mandate for that. That's the provision that requires the Commission to publish these classification guidelines. And it was built into the Act precisely because I think the drafters knew Article 6 would need interpretive guidance to actually make it workable. And the delay matters here because, as Andrew said earlier, we expected these in February 2026. They're arriving in May. Not a huge delay, but I think it tells you something about the difficulty of these classification questions. And the Commission was not slow because these issues were simple. Before we go further, though, I think one framing point is useful for this discussion today. So these guidelines are still in draft, and the AI Omnibus, the piece of legislation, with the proposed amendments to the Act and the phase timelines, is not yet formally adopted. So actually, your specific situation is still going to require your own assessment. What we're trying to do today is give you the operating picture to support in that assessment. And I think with my lawyer's hat on, one point worth holding throughout the conversation today is that misclassification under Article 6 isn't a paperwork problem. As a reminder to us all, Article 99 puts the ceiling at 15 million euros or 3% of global annual turnover. So that's essentially the backdrop against everything that we're talking about today. That said, they're not binding, and ultimately the authoritative interpretation rests with the CJEU. But I think practitioners who ignore them are arguably making a strategic mistake because the market surveillance authorities are going to use them as an operating reference in the meantime. So the question isn't really about, are these law? It's whether your classification rationale survives scrutiny if someone starts looking at them. And I think the publication context here is also worth noting. These guidelines dropped the very same day as the AI Omnibus provisional agreement. And I don't think that's a coincidence. And, I think we agree on that, Andrew. The Commission is trying to give the industry a coherent picture of both the substantive rules and the revised timeline at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the operational implications here is thinking about what evidence you're building because of this. And we are going to dig into this in more detail in the subsequent sections, but I mean, really zoom in on your current AI inventory and the methodology you used. Whether that was sort of around technical architecture or use case categories alone, whether it examined the intended purpose, you want to get clear on what you have so that you can be clear on what you need to have based on what we're going to go over here. And to your point, non-binding, yes, that gives discretions to the court. That gives discretion to other people that aren't the people implementing this. You should treat this as, this is how you should view the program. This is how you should operationalize it. And tailor things as we learn more as they make revisions. But really operationally, I feel like there are three kind of buckets that you might fall into right now. Maybe you haven't started, and oddly enough, that might give you an advantage. You don't have to go back and revise your approach. You can build the program correctly from the start, but your risk is essentially one of urgency. It seems like there's time, but the runway here is shorter than you think. The work to do this is continuous, and it's also difficult to get going. So, you know, all of us need to get going on this, even the folks that haven't started yet. And then there's those that have started, but without the documented reasoning. So you have an inventory, you possibly have the risk tiers, but the classification and rationale cannot match this because we did not know about this, right? So there's the work to be done there. And so you need to come up with the documentation audit that we're going to go into detail on. And then there might be some of you who just think you're completely done, and you're just now realizing that, oh, this isn't maybe done. I might be in that second group, and that's okay. We're gonna walk you through that. The methodology here is clear enough, and we know how to proceed. So I'm gonna hand it back to Richard to really help us better understand the context on intended purpose.
Thanks, Andrew. So Article 312 is what we're talking about here. And that defines intended purpose as what the provider specifies in technical documentation, instructions for use, marketing websites, all of the stuff you can see there on the left-hand side of the slide. So none of that's new, but what the guidelines do is add an interpretation of how that actually operates in practice. And it's more expansive than I think maybe you or I thought it would be, Andrew, and I guess maybe more than others would have thought it would be. And I think it's relevant that 312 is in the definition section of the Act because it then becomes this kind of legal term of art, not just a marketing concept, and it becomes this, I think, hinge concept across the entire classification framework because then every Annex 3 use case, which we're going to talk about later, is matched against the provider's intended purpose, not against what the system technically can do. And boiling that down, I think the Commission's position is that the intended purpose is determined by reading all of those materials as a package. And the guidelines are really clear that that package itself is a classification trigger. So, if you've got a system which is defined narrowly in the technical documentation, but then in all of the marketing literature, it's very broadly defined. It's not a narrowly purposed system under that framework. The marketing description itself is evidence of intended purpose just as much as the technical specification. And then moving to the right-hand side of the slide here, the guidelines go a little bit further. So for systems presented as broadly applicable without consistent limitations, the Commission will deem the intended purpose to encompass high-risk use cases, even where those uses, where those uses are feasible and reasonably foreseeable given the system's capabilities. So this then becomes a foreseeability standard that applies across all of the documentation that we've just referred to, not just the technology. And just a quick word before we move on what reasonably foreseeable means here, because foreseeability standards in EU law typically look at four things. So the system's actual capability, how the provider has positioned it commercially, who the known customer base is, and what use patterns are already observable in the market. And I think the key takeaway here is that a provider can't disclaim foreseeability of a use case that its go-to-market team is pushing, or one where it's apparently obvious that customers are out there deploying it. And for the lawyers in the session, I think, the guidelines are explicit that an exclusion clause in your contracts doesn't overcome this broad marketing position. The reality is this isn't soft guidance, it's the Commission's stated methodology for classification assessment. I've said quite a bit there, Andrew, but would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Yeah, this is the one where I probably have more to say than other sections just because there's so much here to turn into a system, to turn into a process. And, there are pieces of information that you're now collecting where you might not have previously been considering it part of your flow. So we're gonna flag some of those. Marketing in particular. To what extent were you treating them as sort of joint owners of AI risk classification in the past, and possibly not such a big player in the past, now coming into focus. So when we think about the operational considerations here, I'd say first, let's look at the documentation audit. It's not optional pre-work. This is something that needs to be done. And you need to look at what sorts of materials need to fit into this. So it could be technical documents, the marketing site, the sales materials, the case studies, API documentation, contract templates, terms of service. what you may have been collecting previously is something less than this, and you need to find a new way to funnel this into your review. Second, any governance program that doesn't have a process for reviewing these types of materials against the classification, that's now a structural gap. So you're going to have to kind of give yourself this opportunity for improvement and put that into your process. Third, when you find inconsistencies, you have two options. Narrow the marketing to match the technical documentation, I suppose, or update the technical documentation to reflect and manage to this broader use case. It's not just, an inventory that you're taking. It's actually going to cause different types of materials to change based on the decisions that you're going to make. And these kind of two paths are something to keep in mind. When you think about the documentation package that you're creating, though, I think it's worth putting together a list for yourself. I'll try to make a quick one for us here. But in general, it's everything that it describes the intended purpose, which, that's quite broad. So the obvious items we've talked about, we've mentioned the technical documentation, the instructions for use, the API documentation, the developer documentation, maybe it's system or model cards where they exist. But now you're bringing in the marketing and the commercial items. You might have product pages, feature descriptions, capability pages. Maybe it's as far out as blog posts, press releases, product demos, webinars. Like there's a lot of raw material here that you may pull into scope, and you should be identifying what you think is reasonable based on your read of this. The sales and partnership items, the sales decks, the pitch materials, the proof of concept documentation, that starts to become part of this package. The contractual and policy items, Richard flagged the terms of service, acceptable use, enterprise agreements, data processing agreements. These can all include triggers within them. And then, the investor and public communications items, these may not have been flagged in previous, reads of this, but, is there an investor presentation or an earnings call or something that talks about how you think these should be used in the future, or opportunities that there are that are not even being presented in the sales context that could impact this. So that coherence test, what consistently means in practice, that's going to be important because that's a key word for the intended purpose. Doctrine and the guidelines state that providers must consistently limit the system's application or exclude high-risk use cases across these materials. So, as Richard said, you can't just have a clause in your terms of service and say, don't do this. That's going to be insufficient. So this coherence framing is why the documentation package is so broad. And I guess the other contribution I think I can bring to this would be around the kind of the inconsistency patterns that come up in this space. And I have a couple that I'll identify. So, pattern one might be, there's a narrow spec, but there's a broad market. So there's a split here. So that technical documentation describes the system as, aggregated analytics tool or workflow optimization platform. But then the marketing website says something different. The marketing website describes it as helping organizations understand their teams or identify the performance patterns. And this sort of, terminology is different and the marketing is broader. And because of this, the commission will read the package and pay more attention to what the marketing has said in terms of classification of high risk. I'll give a couple more examples. I know you're going to sort of learn it intuitively as you do a few of these, but just to give it a little more, the terms of service carve-out pattern versus the case study contradiction. Terms of service include a clause saying this excludes all the high risk, AI Act use cases or employment evaluation purposes, not possible. And then the case study section of the website shows a customer using the system to evaluate candidates or track individual employees. All right, well, that doesn't line up. Pattern three, maybe it's the product name and there's a positioning problem there. You have something called talent score or performance IQ, and then you say it doesn't do much about talent scoring. That's going to be an issue. So bringing even the naming scheme into play. Pattern four, there's the different audience problem, and I tried to emphasize this earlier, but the sales deck prepared for large buyers, could include specific descriptions of individual level analysis capabilities that the product page doesn't mention. That maybe this, is a way that you're able to sell into more markets and do more things, but this is also affecting the risk for the system. And lastly, I'll say as an example, the API documentation problem. We just think we're going to see this as another common one where developer documentation, the API documentation, it describes capabilities that are more expansive. And maybe people were considering that as it could be done someday, maybe, but now it's part of the context for the risk for that system. So just consider adding this governance function of the classification impact checkpoint, basically, in this content flow. Because not only did you have to take this into account as you put this into your inventory, but I guess I want to flag that over the course of the lifetime of your system, more content will be produced. And so, to what extent do you want to automate or at least have visibility into the flow of documentation updates? This is a change management nightmare of sorts. Some of you will do a lot of it, some of you will do a little, but even a lightweight review or visibility seems like a necessary measure to make sure that you get this right. So, any other thoughts, Richard, as we sort of move into the next segment?
Yeah, I think just one thing that I know you and I have discussed before, and specifically on the comment you made on the two paths that you have when you notice that inconsistency between documentation and and the technical specification or the marketing piece. I think when you look at the two paths, they're actually not symmetrical because narrowing the marketing potentially keeps you out of the high risk regime if you can genuinely live with narrower commercial positioning as a business. Whereas on the flip side, expanding the technical documentation for a more honest reflection of the broader use right, that's going to be the right answer when actually you can't live with that narrower commercial business positioning. But obviously, by doing so, you then pull in all of the chapter three stuff. So the risk management, data governance, logging, everything that goes along with that. So then I think this then becomes not just a paperwork change, but it's a material program change, a material business decision. And it's a joint decision ultimately, which happens cross-functionally between commercial, legal, product, executive leadership, and shouldn't be just something which is, decided by whichever team happens to update their document first to make things sit neatly in the systems and presentationally. So yeah, just a little afterthought on that, I think, but
Yeah,
something
no,
we've
well put. That makes sense.
um So yeah, moving on to segment three and specifically the safety component test. So I think this is going to be one of the pathways most practitioners in specifically, I think in software focused AI governance are going to underestimate because it's this one that lives at the intersection of AI law and product safety law. And just before we get into some of the details, like a super quick orientation. So the Act has two routes into high risk classification. 6.1 covers AI embedded into regulated physical products, which you can see on the left side of the screen there. 6.2 covers AI used in 8 specific societal domains. So that's all of the Annex 3 stuff, which you should be familiar with, and which we'll talk a little bit more about later on in the session. And that's the list I think most software practitioners are currently tracking. So moving back, so Annex 1 is the existing list of EU product safety regimes, things applicable to toys, machinery, medical devices, and the like. And what the AI Act does, it layers on top of those regimes, so it doesn't replace them. So if, practically speaking, if you're building AI into a regulated physical product, you're dealing with two compliance frameworks simultaneously. And Article 6.1 applies only when two conditions are both satisfied. And the first is that the AI system is a safety component of a product covered by Annex 1. So basically, the AI has to be doing something safety relevant inside a regulated physical product. And in a little while, we'll come back to what safety component means in a moment. But because the guidelines have an expanded definition of that. So in the second condition, what we're talking about is that the product itself, not the AI, is the one that EU law requires to go through a third-party conformity assessment. And that's essentially, some of you will know already, that's the regulatory term for external sign-off by a notified body, as opposed to that manufacturer self-certifying itself as having a safe product. So again, toys, machinery, medical devices, these all require third-party assessment, whereas a pure software product on its own typically won't.
Mhm.
So, against that backdrop, um, the guidelines introduce a definition of safety component under Article 314 with two independent prongs. So, the first is intent based. So, you look at where the system's intended purpose is to prevent or mitigate safety risks. So, fairly straightforward. The second, though, is consequence based. So even without a safety regulated or safety related intended purpose, it's where the system's failure or malfunction or some form of error would endanger health and safety of persons or property. And I think it's the consequence based prong is the one that's going to cause the most surprises. And there's a good example given in the guidelines, which we can repeat here. So you could have an AI system which is designed to optimize combustion efficiency in a gas appliance. So, taking a step back, that has an intended purpose of energy efficiency. But practically speaking, its failure could cause carbon monoxide formation, explosion, some form of catastrophe. So it's then a safety component, regardless of what that product was originally designed to do. And then moving back to the conformity assessment condition, I think the decisive factor is not which conformity assessment module the manufacturer chooses. It's whether the product type that you're talking about under the applicable EU harmonization legislation is subject to enhanced regulatory scrutiny as a matter of law. So for products covered by, again, the toy safety regulation, the machinery regulation, those individual manufacturers can't engineer around high risk classification by self-selecting module A, which is the one around self-assessment. The classification follows the product type, not the procedural choice that the manufacturer makes.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot here. Operationally speaking, it helps that this has been so well outlined by you, Richard. But I mean, I think one of the first things is, who's working together. Just like before, when we were talking about that documentation package and making sure that you're really consuming documentation from areas that you might previously not have been considering relevant. Now we're talking about groups of people working together that previously may not have felt like they needed to kind of agree or come to decisions together on something because the 6-1 piece of this is not just a product safety team problem. You've got someone working together here. And while product safety might have handled it before, or regulatory affairs might have handled it before, the AI governance function was maybe focused on Article 6.2, the use cases, the intended purpose, all of that. This division of labor is just not going to work under this portion here, the second prong. The article, 314 doesn't ask what AI systems are designed to do. It asks what happens if the product, this AI system fails. So we've got to think about making sure that our approach from a governance point of view reflects that. So I think maybe, two prongs, two tasks. Let's think about the structure here operationally. Prong one is, a documentation question. Does the provider describe a safety function in the technical docs, the instructions for use, the marketing materials, that kind of thing? If yes, then the intent-based prong is satisfied. And we kind of look at prong two is the product engineering question, really. Regardless of what the system was designed to do, does a failure of the or malfunction endanger health and safety of the person or property in the product's operating context? So this is the thing where you have to figure out system failure modes, and which is kind of an engineering take, or the product's hazard profile, which is more of a product safety or regulatory affairs take. You got to make sure that you're not pretending to be an expert in everything, and that you're bringing together the right people so that you can make the right calls. So And think about this, I guess, where practitioners are going to be drawing the line, what failure or malfunction really covers. I think there are three areas to really pay attention to. Performance drift, for one, is a failure mode. So a computer vision system in a lift that gradually degrades, and then, the obstacle detection accuracy can endanger health and safety just as much as a sudden malfunction. That makes the drift count in this context. Or latency errors could be a failure mode. So an AI system controlling real-time industrial processes that begins to respond outside of its timing specification, that can create unsafe conditions when the output is eventually produced. And so that latency also could count. And then, false negatives as a failure mode, a gas leak, and then it misses that 3% of leaks. And where the endanger physical safety thing here is pretty clear. The point is, a lot of these metrics that you may have been looking at through another lens are now going to have to be looked at through this lens as well. The failure mode and effects analysis for Article 314, with the three steps, keep that in mind. The standard approach is list the system's meaningful failure modes with engineering input. Step two, map each failure mode to the product's operating context. And then step three, for each combination of failure mode and operating context, ask the Article 314 question: does this combination cause the product to enter an unsafe state, prevent a protective response, or enable a hazardous operation? So it's a lot of documentation we're talking about here. Obviously, um, where this might surface in unexpected ways, I just want to flag a few things and I'll hand it back to Richard. We've got a couple examples, I guess HVAC and building automation. So an AI system that optimizes combustion efficiency might seem quite tame, but it's intended to help with energy efficiency, but not a safety function. Prong one is not satisfied, but if its failure can create conditions for carbon monoxide accumulation or combustion instability, prong two is. So the guidelines use this example explicitly. The governance team reviewing smart building AI needs to understand that the building systems the AI integrates with is not just an optimization function. So this is just going to be a challenge to identify all these use cases correctly. As you can see, I'll give one more example or maybe two. Architectural, agricultural technology, precision spraying, targeted chemical applications on agricultural land. The intended purpose, make sure you optimize the chemical use and reduce waste. But the failure here could account for failure to account for the worker locations and the chemical application. So prong two satisfied again, explicitly part of the guidelines, something to look at. It really is a difficult thing to get right. So bringing these right people together, make sure that you have the right process. I think the most immediately actionable point for most of this audience is going back to your AI inventory. It probably doesn't capture all of the embedded AI that needs this Article 6.1 review. So as much as I just said all of that was challenging, keep in mind that there are some other areas like software-focused discovery exercises don't reach hardware engineering teams. So I'm trying to account for more industries than just, SaaS here. There might be industrial equipment with firmware upgrades and things like that that are not just going to be part of your regular scans. You're going to have to go deeper and find those. Two additional gaps you might find, AI added to an existing product through software updates. Again, it's about this continuous monitoring and making sure that the triggering is appropriate. And, embedded AI components that come in through suppliers, maybe a component of that can bring you into scope. So separate discovery exercise targeting hardware targeting software updates, targeting some of these implications that we talked about may be appropriate in addition to all the other work that you'll be planning to do to meet this. So I think we made it sound sufficiently difficult, Richard. How about we go on to the build review now? Hopefully that
Yeah.
is a little bit easier to understand.
No, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so the next segment is going to be a discussion of the Article 6 uh, filter mechanism. But before we do that, I just wanted to sort of have a little bit of grounding again here. So Annex 3 has 8 high risk areas. I'm not going to read them out. You can see them on the screen there. The structure, I think, matters here because being in one of these areas, as a reminder, isn't enough to be determined to have a high risk system. Each area itself contains a specific list of use cases, and your system's only in scope if your documented intended purpose matches one of those specific use cases. So, a HR product is not high risk just because employment is on the list, but it would be high risk if its intended purpose matches recruitment, performance evaluation, or one of the other use cases in Annex 3. And that matching exercise comes first before you look at the filter mechanism we're going to discuss on the next slide. So that you have to do the matching piece before you look at the filter. Thanks, Andrew. So we can see here on the left-hand side of the slide, the filter mechanism in Article 6.3 is, I think, before we dive in, potentially the most misunderstood provision in the classification framework. And I think, Andrew, you'd agree with that, because I think practitioners start from the position of these are 4 really handy ways to avoid high risk classification. And actually, what we see in the guidelines that, is that actually it's a considerably narrower interpretation than that. So there's these 4 conditions, narrow procedural task, improving a previously completed human activity, detecting decision-making patterns without influencing live assessments, and a preparatory task. And Andrew's going to go into a little bit more detail in a moment on those. But what the guidelines do is establish 3 important constraints on how those operate. So those are on the right-hand side of the slide there. The first one is that the conditions must be interpreted narrowly. So, taking a step back, this is an exception from rules protecting fundamental rights. And actually, the Commission says so explicitly. So, an argument that requires generous reading of a condition is not going to be a solid filter argument under here. The second is that, you know, even if something at the component level, is assessed to be is assessed to meet one of these, um, the whole system is looked at. So actually, if an individual component isn't high risk, but it's part of a high risk use case, the filter is applied at the system level. So this is what we talked about as the anti-fragmentation principle, and it extends explicitly to something that's obviously a hot topic right now, agentic AI systems. And thirdly, the filter is categorically unavailable for any system performing profiling of natural persons within the meaning of Article 4.4 of the GDPR. And just as a quick reminder, that's the one that defines profiling as automated processing of personal data to evaluate personal aspects, performance at work, economic situation, and the like, and a few others. So the other important thing here is that Article 6.4 creates a pre-market documentation obligation. So providers who self-assess as non-high risk right now using one of these filters have to document that assessment before placing the system on the market. This is not something that you can kind of go ahead and do retrospectively. And I think, and as a final point before you jump in, Andrew, and one distinction I think legal practitioners specifically need to hold clearly, this filter mechanism is exclusively an Article 6.2 Annex 3 mechanism. So those 8 societal domains, it has no application whatsoever to all of the product safety piece that we've talked about under Article 6 Annex 1 systems.
Yeah, turns out this section isn't sounding that much easier than the other one, but doing our best. I agree though, The filter issue here is that it's going to be less applicable than people were hoping. I'm going to go condition by condition to talk about some of the ways of thinking about the operation around this, and try to say a little less than I have on the other topics because there's so much to cover here. But yeah, let's start with condition A, the narrow procedural task, the test where most systems are going to fail. The problem in practice, let's look at, an example, is the condition most commonly invoked by providers for the systems that don't qualify here. Let's look at examples. So a resume parser extracts structured data from unstructured text. So it's extracting name, it's extracting date, and job titles. It may qualify. A resume parser that screens candidates and ranks them by fit does not. The output is what matters in this scenario, right? The structured data output from fixed criteria potentially qualifies, evaluation score ranking does not. So what at first might have looked like, oh yeah, I kind of get what to do. You realize that, okay, that's actually a little more narrow than I hoped, considering that, one is in and one is out. Okay, so condition B, let's look at what that, scenario looked like. The improving a previously completed human activity. The critical requirement here when you're the one doing the analysis or you're reviewing the analysis, the human activity must have genuinely been completed before the AI system is applied. And the AI must not produce a materially different result from what the human produced. Both of those things matter, so that's going to be how it breaks essentially. So there's the sequencing problem. If we looked at the workflow has a human review, the AI output rather than the AI reviewing the human output, this can flip the order and make it so that the condition is not met. So you really have to look at that order. The material difference problem, I guess, would be if the AI system's output is substantially different from what the human produced. So a different recommendation, different categorization, different conclusion, that might have been the benefit of adding the AI system, right? That the disagreement is what provides value, makes you come back to it, et cetera. That said, it's not going to help you under this filtering condition. Condition C, so this is 3 out of 4, I suppose. Condition C, pattern detection. Let's take a look. Cover systems that analyze historic decisions to identify patterns or anomalies without proposing outcomes on live cases. So it's retrospective analysis. So reviewing completed decisions to find issues. The moment there's some sort of ongoing or live case aspect, it's not met. Sounds obvious, but obviously, these two things can go together frequently, and just that scope issue can create an issue under the condition. Condition D, that's covering the task that precede the actual assessment process with very low potential impact of what follows. So the requirement is like a genuine separation. The task happens before the assessment begins, and the output is not really influencing the assessment outcome. So making sure that that is actually true, that the preparatory work, the data formatting before human assessment begins, the document ingestion, all of that has to be looked at to make sure that you're really getting that right. And the blocking constraints, these were kind of covered by Richard already, so I won't go into detail on those, but that adds in an additional layer to this analysis that I think is challenging. So remember, I guess, what to do if the filter argument breaks for you. If the analysis reveals that the filter argument doesn't hold, then that's where the classification is going to become high risk. And the governance response is not going to be, let's find other filter arguments. Or, shouldn't be. It's to begin figuring out how to adjust the compliance program for this high risk AI system, which is quite the challenge. I don't know if Richard, you have additional context or thoughts on this topic, but it's a hard one.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just one brief thing, just being kind of conscious of time because I think
Yeah.
we're potentially running a little bit long. I think, I've touched on it, you've touched on it already, but one thing I wanted to underline was specifically on Article 6.4 again, and I guess the documentation timing piece is a pre-market obligation. So organizations that are out there with systems on the market without this documentation in place already have a retroactive gap. And then I think the question then becomes for those organizations isn't whether you go and build that documentation, you have to, it's how quickly and also how to do that in a way which doesn't itself create an evidentiary problem, which is probably a question we could have a whole other session on, but just a bit of sort of food for thought at the end of that segment.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Let's get into the deployer trap here.
Yeah, 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 and I think that this for me is the one I find most interesting,
Mm.
particularly coming, I suppose, from the privacy background and questions around when controllers become processors, processors become controllers, and all of that piece as well. So, sort of, the where the lines get blurred. So, Article 25(1) of the Act is arguably the provision that will generate, I think, the most unexpected compliance obligations for organizations, specifically those that see very firmly we are very much in the deployer camp rather than being a provider. But there are three triggers that convert a deployer into a provider with full provider obligations. One point to ground us here, though, is that Article 25 is the provision that allocates obligations between providers and deployers across the Act. So, most organizations sit on the deployer side and assume that they're going to stay there, whereas Article 25(1) is essentially the rule that tells you when you have crossed that line and inherited those full provider obligations under Chapter 3. So, working just very quickly through the three. First one, very simple. If you affix your name or trademark to a high risk system that's already on the market, you're going to get caught and you will become a provider in that context. The second is if you make a substantial modification to a high risk AI system, and that keeps it high risk. Again, relatively straightforward.
Mhm.
Third, though, is the one I think which has the widest operational footprint is when you modify the intended purpose of a non-high risk AI system in a way that makes it high risk. And just a very basic example would be, we've got a provider of a general purpose AI model with documentation which documents a very broad applicable intended purpose. A deployer takes that model, fine tunes it for employment screening, and names it as an employment AI product and builds it into their HR platform. Under the guidelines, you've got a very clear shift there, and under Article 25(1), that deployer has modified the intended purpose to make that system high risk. They're now a provider. And the
Mhm.
guidelines also note that the Commission is preparing separate guidance on 25(1). But for now, the three triggers are in the Act itself, and the guidelines are very clear that those apply. I think one practical note, and again, this is something that you and I have discussed before, Andrew, is that in the absence of that finalized guidance, the working interpretation most people are working to for substantial modification, which is an important term, is a change that either alters the system's intended purpose, its performance characteristics in a material way, or its risk profile. So I think some basic examples. What does that mean? So if you're fine-tuning your own data, that's most likely to be treated as substantial. Um, Configuration alone, if you're just adjusting the settings that are made available by the provider, already built into the product, that's probably not. That said, I think that's a very neat conclusion to draw, and actually, the grey and the lines between that are going to get tested in the first wave of enforcement. So I wouldn't just assume a very basic kind of permissive reading of that is gonna hold when tested. Andrew, did you have some thoughts on that too?
Yeah, I just want to give an example or two to flesh these triggers out. But I think they're well explained by you here. So looking at trigger one around the branding, I mean, the most basic one, I guess, would just be white labeling, right? You have a software company, they buy access to a foundation model through an API, they build a product, around it. Now, the product has their name on it, they sell it to enterprise clients, and from the software company's perspective, they built the product, right? But from the Axe perspective, they affix their name to a high-risk AI system, right? Like that could be the outcome. So making sure that you really are looking at it from that point of view. I think the internal cases are maybe slightly trickier because an organization might deploy a foundation model internally, wrap it in a custom interface, name it Ask HR or Policy Bot or something, and roll it out to the workforce. And the organization, from the organization's perspective, this is, procurement and deployment decision. But from the AI Act's perspective, if the internal tool's intended purpose falls within this, Annex 3, employment advice, whatever keys it's hitting, the organization may have affixed their name to the high risk system and assumed provider obligations. So maybe that's less likely to happen to you, but certainly an interesting way of looking at the first trigger a bit differently. Now, the second one, substantial modification, just trying to figure out, I guess, the guidelines note that the commission is preparing separate guidance. So I think that'll be helpful. There are a couple scenarios, maybe from least to most likely, to think about. Configuration within documented parameters. If you look at that, adjusting system settings within the vendor's documentation, formats and things like this without changing the underlying model, not substantial, right? And then maybe RAG and retrieval integration, you're going to have connected systems that, now might change the behavior of the system. This is contested territory. The output changes significantly because the knowledge base changes. Whether this constitutes substantial modification depends on whether the output change affects the system's behavior in a high risk use case. You'll see some things around fine tuning as well, system integration that changes the decision pathways. I think each one of these will become interesting to define. Hopefully the further guidance makes this a bit easier for us. When I look at trigger 3, the purpose modification, modifying the intended purpose of a non-high risk to make it high risk, a foundation model provider documents their model as broadly applicable, right? This scenario plays out across the market right now. Organizations are building, specialized HR, AI, credit decision making, whatever it is, on top of the foundation model and describing the results as a deployment decision. This is just going to be one of those things that 3 was designed for. So I would say operationally, I think that gives you some examples to think through this with. Be careful with your vendor questions, I suppose, to better understand from a due diligence point of view what it is that you're consuming and how it might affect this analysis. That could save you loads of issues down the road. But let's, considering the timing, take a look at the timing related to this act and make sure we have a chance to cover that.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So, yeah, I won't spend too long on my section on this because I think you've got the more sort of substantive things to say. But just very quickly, the Omnibus Provisional Agreement revises some of the timelines and rollout dates from the Act, and specifically under Article 113. So right now, under that provisional agreement, Article 6.2 Annex 3 obligations will be from the 2nd of December 2027. And the Article 6.1 Annex 1 obligations will be from the 2nd of August 2028. Two other, I guess, key dates for public authority deployments under Article 111.2, we're looking at the 2nd of August 2030. And then for legacy systems in large-scale IT systems, it's the 31st of December 2030. It is provisional right now, but I think we're largely as a profession kind of working on the basis that it will be formalized very, very soon. On the consultation itself, Andrew's mentioned it already, the guidelines are in draft, and the Commission is seeking stakeholder feedback through the AI Act Service Desk. So if you do have specific concrete concerns, there is this real and time limited opportunity to submit feedback that's going to influence that final text. So definitely go ahead and do that if this is raising some interesting questions for you. But yeah, Andrew, wanted to give you the chance to talk on the timeline too and what this means for practitioners.
Yeah, yeah. Let me just kind of make 2 points on this, and then I think we'll do some final remarks and close it out. I don't think there's going to be time for questions today, but if you submit some interesting ones, perhaps we can extend our blog series in response to what we see there. Um, so first point, while this is a delay, it's not a reason to wait. What are you going to build given the time that you have? I think, four things. You need a complete AI inventory built the way that we talked about with the classification, the documenting with these intended purpose packages that we discussed. You're going to have Article 6.3 filter self-assessments with Article 6.4 documentation where applicable. So that's two. Three, you're going to have the failure mode analysis for 6.1 systems, pipeline maps, could get complex on that one, architectures, etc. And then fourth, we barely touched it, but I think you got that there's a vendor diligence process update to look at that Article 25.1 exposure here as well. And those four things, that's plenty of work to get in place before the deadline. None of these things can be done quickly. And then I think the second piece for those who are inclined is to take a look at this consultation window and decide if you want to use it. It's still in draft. You can share your ideas. I think particularly around specific friction points where you understand the operational implications might be complex. Look at the pieces with the complex architectures. Look at the filter boundary cases. Look at the intended purpose package standard and whether that you think it makes sense, and see if you want to share some information there. Obviously, your expertise could influence the final outcome and be quite helpful. So, yeah, Richard, final thoughts?
Yeah, and I'll try and be brief, conscious of time. So I think, the classification framework we've talked about today it's not a new set of rules. It's the Commission's interpretation of those rules that have been enforced since August, 2024, and we've all been aware of. What is new is the methodology. And that methodology, I think, has a specific feature worth repeating again here. And we've touched on it a few times because it moves the center of gravity of AI compliance away from the technology itself onto all of the documentation that surrounds it. And that's a significant shift because I think previously the question was, what does the system do? Now it's what have you collectively as an organization represented this system will do across every single channel that you control. And the first question is a technical one. The second one becomes this big documentation discipline, which Andrew's talked a lot about on the session today already. And I think for the lawyers in the audience, if there are any, this means, classification is no longer something you can outsource to the product team safely. It becomes this big cross-functional analysis that has to integrate, the market position, your contractual reps and warranties, your technical specifications, and essentially all of your customer-facing materials. And that whole documentation package becomes a legal instrument. And for governance leads on the other side, I think, your classification work product then needs to be completely defensible against a reader who completely understands these guidelines and is looking for those inconsistencies. And that becomes the standard, and the methodology is now clear. We've got a reference document, and, whether it's legally binding or not, the member states are all going to be working from it. So the only remaining variable is really whether your organization has done, any work to meet that. And that I think is the question we all need to look at, and every one of us should go away and think about in the next 12 months, and ultimately act upon it. Andrew, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for joining us. I think this is, it shows you that it takes this long just to accurately describe what to do. So imagine doing the work. So I think there's a lot ahead of us. As we're often asked, we will be sharing the slides, we will be sharing the recording. And we have been writing about this for some time as well. So we have a six-part blog series that we'll follow up with some links for as well. We super appreciate you joining us today, and this is definitely a topic we're going to be keeping an eye on and doing some more work on in the future. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.